Hello, and welcome to Apocalypse Extravaganza. This is Chapter 2, where I continue the writing exercise, in which I take suggestions for characters from the audience. I've already received some suggestions and have started to implement it in the story. Chapter 2, The Landing. I did not know where this door would take me, but I imagined that it would not be long until the water levels would recede. I figured, then, that the current would flow back into the ocean once more. I figured I could possibly be rescued then, but had no idea how long it would take. I spent a lot of time figuring, thinking, until I started to see the top of a building in the distance. There were maybe only 3 or 4 floors sticking out of the water. It was too far to make out, but there seemed to be some people on top of it. I kicked my legs in desperation to make it to this new landmark. Landmark? I laughed at the irony. Maybe I should call it a watermark now, I thought, to replace the word, but wound up with another that already had a meaning. Geez, that's real funny, ain't it? I said to myself, assuming a second personality. What's funny is that I'm making jokes at a time like this. You're right. What's funny about this? If the water is this high, think of the planet. Think of the world. Do you think this is exclusive to Japan only? The currents grew stronger and pushed me further inland. And as hard as I attempted to maneuver the door towards the towers, few dry floors, I found myself getting further and further away. The sun was setting, and the clouds were furled in the skies above, begging to release their burden. I knew I would be in for a tough night if it rained, so I decided to conserve my energy and give my body parts as much time above water as I could. To do so, I would stick my shins and feet up onto the floating doorway while I looked up into the sky. That night, just before the rain began to fall, I smoked a cigarette and played a single song on my phone before turning it off to conserve battery. I tied the plastic bag around the doorknob and prepared for the torture that promised itself to me. I don't know how I made it alive that night. The waters grew colder and colder. I grew more and more tired. My grasp loosened. I manically swapped between harrowed panic and pained fortitude. It seemed as though the former would win out until my door ran up onto a rocky shore. I grabbed my valuables and took my first steps out of the water. The wind was strong, and my first inclination was to get back into the water, where at least my body would be spared the chilly gusts. But then I thought that I would be better off finding some kind of shelter. It was too dark to make out anything clearly, but perhaps someone was nearby who could help me. I called out as loud as my frail voice could, and waited to hear an answer. Crack! A lightning shot out, giving me a brief glimpse of my surroundings. I was standing on some kind of mountain, it seemed. My first impression was that it was shaped a lot like Fuji-san. Help! I called out again, and this time I heard someone call back. I followed the voice, my wrinkly feet cutting themselves on rocky surfaces. Here! I shouted in Japanese. Come! I heard back. I spent that night curled up inside a stone shelter at the top of the mountain, just outside of the storm's reach. There were others too, but I didn't count them. I was too exhausted, and despite nearly freezing, my eyes shut and I found sleep, at least for a couple of hours. I woke up shivering, but glad at least to see that I was still alive. And not only that, I wasn't alone. I looked around and counted 8 others inside the shelter. There were 5 Japanese and 3 Caucasians. They seemed to be geared for trekking. Tourists, I guess. I got up and waved to a shorter Japanese man in his late 40s as he stood up and went outside. I followed him out and looked around. I stood on the precipice of a giant crater. Surely this was Fuji Mountain. I had seen it in photos. I knew what it looked like. "Where?" I mustered. "Do you speak Japanese?" he asked. "A little. Can you speak English?" He shook his head. I asked him again where we were. "Fuji," he replied solemnly. Fuji. Fuji. What once stood tall and proud above its surroundings had now been reduced to a small rock island. The water had risen so high, even the crater was partially filled. I couldn't understand it. How could the waters have risen so high? "I'm Joe," I introduced myself. "Nice to meet you." The short man said something I couldn't quite make out before introducing himself. "Toda Taiji," he said. And that concludes Chapter 2 of this first episode of Apocalypse Extravaganza. If you would like to comment or make suggestions for the story, please do so. I look forward to hearing what you might have to say about this. Take care.